Hi, my name is Anna Ray, and I'm going to be your instructor today for your general psychology course. Today, our topic is going to go over classical conditioning. So, our learning objectives for today are going to be that we'll be able to describe the elements of classical conditioning, we'll be able to describe the process of establishing a classically conditioned response, provide examples of classical conditioning in humans, and explain how classical conditioning is selective. So, does anybody know what classical conditioning is?
No.
Well, classical conditioning was discovered by a Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. It is a form of learning where two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response. So, Pavlov discovered this accidentally when studying digestion, which begins when saliva mixes with food in the mouth. When he was measuring how much saliva dogs produce when given food, he noticed that the dogs began to salivate at the mere sight of food and at the sound of his footsteps going to get the food, even before the dogs tasted the food. This led Pavlov to come up with a question. He wanted to know um, is are the dogs salivating to sight and sound? To study this, Pavlov rang a bell right before presenting his dogs with food. A bell normally does not elicit salivation, so Pavlov did this every time he fed his dog. In time, the dog began to salivate as soon as the bell was rung, signaling to the dog that food would appear soon after. Pavlov found that this conditioned response would continue to occur even if he did not appear with food or appear after, with food after the bell. So the four basic elements to classical conditioning are shown in this diagram. The conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, and the unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus is an event that automatically elicits an unconditioned response, or in other words, a reflex reaction. In Pavlov's study, food was the unconditioned stimulus, and salivation was the unconditioned response. The third element to classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus, is an event that is repeatedly paired to the unconditioned stimulus. If you remember, Pavlov used a bell as a conditioned stimulus. At first, the conditioned stimulus does not elicit the desired response. But if you repeatedly pair the unconditioned stimulus to the conditioned stimulus can alone trigger a reaction to the unconditioned response. This learned reaction is known as conditioned response. Before we move forward, does anybody have any questions?
So just by ringing the bell every time he fed his dog, Pavlov was able to condition the dog to salivate when the bell rang?
That is absolutely correct. So he had used his conditioned stimulus, which was the bell, and he paired that with his unconditioned response, the food, to create a conditioned response of salivation every time the bell was ring, even without food. So, establishing a classically conditioned response takes repeated pairing, strength of pairing, and also depends on the spacing of pairing. So, repeated pairing of unconditioned stimulus and a cue before an unconditioned response eventually becomes a conditioned response is needed every time to get the response that you're looking for. The likelihood or the strength of the conditioned response increases each time these two stimuli are paired. This learning, however, eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns, as you can see in this graph right here. So every time you pair, the subject or the person learns to respond that way and learns that this response is going to continue to happen until it plateaus. This learning, however, like I said, eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns. The amount of increase gradually becomes smaller and smaller until finally no further learning occurs, as I illustrated in the graph. Because of the number of pairings are usually needed to produce a conditioned response, only a cue consistently related to the unconditioned stimulus typically become a conditioned stimulus. The spacing of pairing is also important in establishing a classically conditioned response. If pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus follow each other very rapidly or very far apart, the learning association is slower. If the pairing is moderate, neither too close together or too far apart, the learning association is faster. So it is important that the CS and the US, the unconditioned stimuli, are never alone. The infrequently pairing the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus reduces the rate of learning and the final strength of the learned response. This is called intermediate pairing. So, moving on to classical conditioning in humans. Does anybody have an example of classical conditioning in humans?
No.
Okay, well, classical conditioning in humans is as common in humans as it is in animals. The influences of classical conditioning can be seen in responses such as phobias, nausea, advertising, and sexual arousal. A familiar example is conditioned nausea, in which the sight of food or the smell of a particular food causes nausea because it has caused an upset stomach or a illness in the past. Similarly, when the sight of a dog has been associated with a memory of being bitten, the result may be a conditioned fear of dogs. This is also seen in advertisements. Advertising executives, for example, are apt at using this way of thinking. Think about car commercials that you have seen on television. Many of them feature an attractive model. By associating the model with a car being advertised, you may come to see that the car is being more desirable. According to research, men who viewed a car commercial that included an attractive model later rated the car as being faster, more appealing, and better designed than did men who viewed the advertisement for the same car without an attractive model. Another but very unethical story of classical conditioning in a human was in the early 1900s. John B. Watson carried out a controversial classical conditioning experiment on an infant boy called Little Albert. Watson was interested in examining the effects of conditioning on the fear response in humans, and he introduced Little Albert to a number of items, such as a white rat, a bunny, and even a dog. After, well, Albert was originally not fearful of any of these items. Watson then allowed Albert to play with the rat, but as Albert played with the rat, Watson suddenly banged a hammer on a metal bar. Once he banged this hammer on the metal bar, little Albert cried out and screamed. Each time Albert touched the rat, Watson again banged the hammer on the metal bar. Watson was able to successfully condition poor little Albert to fear the rat because its association with a loud noise. Eventually, Albert was conditioned to fear other similar furry white items such as a rabbit and even a Santa Claus mask that Watson had worn. While Watson's research did provide some new insight into conditioning, it would be definitely considered unethical by current ethical standards set forth by the American Psychological Association. So, classical conditioning and therapy. Classical conditioning has been used as a successful form of treatment in changing or modifying behaviors such as substance abuse, fears, phobias, and smoking. Some therapies associated with classical conditioning include aversion therapy, systematic desensitization, and flooding. Aversion therapy is a type of behavior therapy designed to encourage individuals to give up undesirable habits by causing them to associate that habit with an unpleasant effect, such as if you started associating smoking with an unpleasant smell or taste, you would want to avert from smoking. Systematic desensitization is a treatment for phobias in which individual is trained to relax while being exposed to their phobia um, more and more progressively with more anxiety provoking stimuli. So, for instance, in the picture that I have up right now, we have a little girl. It's having a phobia with spiders. On the right or left hand side, you can see her beats per minute, her heart beats per minute. And then as you go down, you can see that her phobia, by getting a little bit closer, working with a picture of a spider, second a toy of a spider, then touching a dead spider, and then finally moving on to a live spider. She's at the end able to hold that live spider, even though her it may be an anxiety provoking stimuli, but her beats per minute have gone down by slowly working her up. And the last therapy is flooding, which is a form of desensitization used to use repeated that uses repeated exposure to highly distressing stimuli until the lack of reinforcement of the anxiety response causes an extinction. So, classical conditioning is selective, meaning we do not associate every event that has caused pain or discomfort in our lives with the development of a phobia over that incident. The concept of preparedness, which means that some things are readily become conditioned stimuli for fear responses because they are biologically prepared for these associations, is part of the reason why. Some of the common objects of biological phobias could be thought of as like being afraid of heights, snakes, and afraid of the dark. Preparedness also underlies the conditioned taste aversion, which is a learned association between taste and certain foods and the feeling of nausea. So, conditioned taste aversion are acquired very quickly. It usually only takes one pairing of a distinct flavor and a subsequent illness to develop a learned aversion to the taste of that food. Readily learning connections between distinct flavors and illness has its clear benefits, though. If we can quickly learn which foods are poisonous and avoid the foods in the future, we greatly increase our chances of survival. So, this is also seen in other animals as well. They also develop taste aversions, such as rats, mice, and conditioned taste aversion with conditioned taste aversion, just as humans do. So, to summarize what we've gone over today, we've learned about Ivan Pavlov and how he discovered classical conditioning. We also talked about classical conditioning and how what the four basic elements are: the US, UR, CS, and CR. We also talked about how classical conditioning takes repeated pairing and that is neither too far apart or too close together. We learned what intermediate pairing is and how it weakens the effectiveness of classical conditioning. And we've also learned that classical conditioning can be used to create phobias, taste aversions, and can also be used in different forms of therapy. And lastly, we have learned that classical conditioning is common in humans as it is in animals. Are there any questions?
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much and have a good day.